The words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. I just want to say thank you so much, Jackie, for your living epistle. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Joanne and George, for giving us that gift of the beautiful hymn, Make Me a Channel of Your Peace. Those beautiful yet challenging words based on the prayer attributed to St. Francis of Assisi on this, his feast day. St. Francis is widely known as a great lover of all of God's creation and for his great humility and generosity. Of all the saints, Francis is one of the most popular and admired, but probably the least imitated. Few have attained his total identification with the poverty and suffering of Christ. Born the son of a wealthy cloth merchant of Assisi in 1182, his early youth was spent in harmless revelry and fruitless attempts to win military glory. But various encounters with beggars and lepers needled his conscience as a young man. And while praying in the small broken down church of San Damiano in Assisi, he heard a voice which seemed to come from the crucifix in the church. And the voice said, "Go and repair my house, which you see is falling down." And that is what Francis set out to do, selling his possessions, renouncing his entire inheritance, even selling his clothes in order to repair God's church. Over these past 6 months, we have been reminded just how fragile life is, how each day, each moment is a gift for us and for those whom we love. We have been faced with how much pain there is in the world, in our nation. And we are reminded how each of us has a responsibility to bring peace, love, forgiveness, faith, hope, light, and even joy into this hurting world. And it is only through God's grace that we can even attempt to do any of this. And today, being the feast day of St. Francis, we will have the blessing of the animals later this afternoon. Always a joyous and fun, even raucous time. Even if we are all socially distanced and we, two-legged creatures, are wearing masks. It is always interesting to see how the different animals react to each other and to us. Some are quite shy and maybe even shaking a bit, looking around and taking everything in, while others are right out there, barking excitedly, tails wagging, hardly able to contain themselves. And watching all of this, being in the midst of all of this, always reminds me that a huge part of life, a huge part of what we teach our children is how to get along with each other. And that's a huge part of what God is communicating to the Israelites in this morning's lesson from the book of Exodus. How to get along, how to live in life-giving relationship with each other and with our God. Rabbi Jonathan Magenet points out that what we call the 10 Commandments in biblical and rabbinical terminology are not called commandments at all, but are the 10 words. And he believes this affects the way one understands the prohibitions they contain. Instead of thinking of them as straight commands, thou shalt not do A, B, or C, one would think of the 10 words more along the lines of, once you enter into this covenant with God, you could not possibly wish to do any of these things. So perhaps these 10 words are more like a framework through which life, specifically life with God, can be interpreted. And he believes if we are understanding the 10 words as a list of restrictive regulations or burdens, then we are ignoring a key element, namely that they begin not with an order, but rather with a reminder of God's deliverance of the Israelites. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. We will probably always refer to these declarations as the 10 Commandments, but we can also think of them in terms of showing us how to live in God's kingdom with love and respect for God, for each other, for all of God's creation, and for ourselves. As preacher Tom Long reads these, because the Lord is your God, the 10 words affirm, you are free not to need any other gods. You are free to rest on the 7th day. You are free from the tyranny of lifeless idols, free from murder, stealing, and coveting as ways to establish yourself in the land. The 10 words begin with the good news of what God has done, and then describes the shape of what that freedom can look like. In our words and in our stories, we pass on more than memories to our children. We pass on our beliefs, how we see the world. We pass on our ideals and how to live with others, how to respect the dignity of every human being or not. When I was serving as a hospital chaplain during seminary, one of the patients who made a lasting impression on me was a young woman who had had a stroke and who was firm in her belief that she and God were going to get her through this and back on her feet. And over the days that I visited her, she went on to tell me bits and pieces of her story of all the previous moments in her life when she had gone through very difficult times, being raised by her elderly grandmother, who had stepped in to pick up the pieces and raise her young granddaughter after this patient's mother had taken off and left her. And she talked about making it through various health issues over the years and learning how to live with diabetes. She talked about putting herself through college and getting a job after a heartbreaking divorce. And she said firmly that God had seen her through each time, and she just knew that God would see her through her recovery from this stroke. She was grateful to God and to those folks, especially her grandmother, who had stood beside her through each one of those challenges. And she was going to get through this so that she could continue to be there for others. And in Tom Long's view, that's the way the 10 words work. First comes the experience of being cared for, the experience of being set free from whatever was causing you to bind yourself up. All of this preserved in the form of our stories. And then there follows the life shaped ethically around our profound stories. The story of a grandmother who steps in to pick up the pieces and raise her young granddaughter through the trials of childhood, adolescence, and turbulent teen years. This story becomes the story of a granddaughter, now a young woman, taking on challenge after challenge in order to be able to step in and help pick up the pieces and be there for others. The stories which we pass along to our children matter. How we help our children to shape their stories in their own lives matters. God's declaration that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of slavery. This allows us not only to live our lives shaped by grace, but moves us to live these lives shaped by this grace given to us by this God. The first word of life with God is to remember what God has done for you. And all the other commandments flow from this. Life with God is both relationship with God and relationship with others. Jesus affirmed this when he refused to separate the commandments to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind from love your neighbor as yourself. The 10 words are a response to God's grace. But Rabbi Jonathan Maginot notes that for the 10 words to be effective, we are called to do all we can to preserve our relationship with our fellow human beings with whom we are to share and work out our individual and collective destiny. Not an easy charge. And we are called to do all we can to share our God-given gifts, to preserve our relationship, not only with our fellow human beings, but with all of God's creatures and creation. For we all have a role in building up God's kingdom. Amen.